Alrighty. I am just going to start now. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us, and very much a huge warm welcome to this Young Fabians Black History Month conversation with David Lammy. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tesfay. My pronouns are he, him. And among other things, I am the Open Labour BAME officer, a member of the Young Fabians, and one of the co-founders of the 1987 caucus. So shout out to them lot, or any of those members. But yeah, you're not here to hear from me and my life story. You're here to hear from the man himself, the MP for Tottenham, the Shadow Justice Secretary, and hopefully the future Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab's replacement right here, if he doesn't get sacked in the next cabinet reshuffle. But yeah, David, how are you tonight?
I'm very well, thank you. Great to join you.
Yeah, well, when I was offered this opportunity to have this conversation, to host this event with David Lammy, I was given this opportunity with one explicit promise. I'm not allowed to mention Tottenham Hotspur. I'm very sorry, but as a Chelsea fan, I feel duty bound to mention that. But that's it. I'll throw her out. No more. But I guess that links back to like the start and like the first, my first question, and that is your upbringing. You're very much a proud Tottenham boy, and of course, you know, we talk about Black History Month. You're very much a historic figure, considering that you were the first Black Briton to attend Harvard School and Harvard Law School. What does it felt like to be that person from Tottenham going all the way to Harvard after graduating from SOAS?
Well, you know, I should say that before I went to Harvard Law School, I left Tottenham at the age of 11 and went to the King's Cathedral School in Peterborough, where I was a cathedral chorister. In so many ways, that was a much bigger jump, leaving inner city Tottenham in the early 80s to go to what felt like the other end of the world. It was only 2 hours away by car, but the new town of Peterborough was an immense suburban dream, very different from inner city Tottenham. And then I came back to London and I went to SOAS in London. And I should say also that going to university, being the first in my family to go to university, was a huge thing. And if you like, spending time in the centre of London, in the Bloomsbury area of London, where SOAS and UCL and other parts of the University of London are based. So yes, it was huge going to Harvard. It was huge because it was Harvard. I mean, you know, it had this huge reputation, and I knew it had this huge reputation. It still does. And in a sense, I made the journey as the first Black Briton, I understand, to go to the law school. I didn't realize that at the time when I applied, but Harvard told me that. It's become far more common, I think, for young Brits to make their way to the States, to Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Stanford, Berkeley, than it was then. So I don't know if the transition was that hard. It was a very exciting time to be in the United States. Bill Clinton was president. He had been caught up in the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And Britain at that time was being led by John Major, and it was all a bit depressing. He was running the sort of back to basics campaign, and it didn't feel fantastic, although it shortly changed because Tony Blair subsequently became Prime Minister. So I would say that what I got from being at Harvard, was that sense of the Cambridge, Massachusetts area where Harvard is based is a wonderful part of the Boston, Massachusetts area. It's a really beautiful town, really. The Harvard campus is wonderful. What I thought was amazing there was that this sense that you could be at the center of the world, that the world's great leaders passed through and gave speeches. Businessmen passed through and made speeches. You really felt at the center of stuff. If you went to the library and asked for a book and they didn't have it, they were embarrassed and they would order it. So they had it as soon as possible. And obviously the resources, the sort of sense of, Americans don't do things in halves. So that was there was no sense at all of economy or cutting back or efficiencies or anything like that. It was all very big. And that was a new experience for me, because that certainly wasn't the case at SOAS. And actually, the other thing I would say about Harvard is that I found it very international. I was doing the LLM master's program, which is very international, but actually it was very diverse. I learned there that you could be an elite institution and it could be diverse with African Americans, Native Americans, white working class, veterans, people from all corners of the world. I had experienced that at SOAS. I wasn't quite expecting it when I got to Harvard, and I was really pleased that that was present in a big, big way, which I think would also be quite different if you were at Oxbridge. It's not, I mean, it's international, but it's not, obviously, it doesn't reflect the diversity of the UK in the same way. So, yeah, that was my experience of going to Harvard. And then obviously going on to, at that stage, most people want to go and do a year or two in New York in a law firm. When I was there, it was the beginning of the dot-com explosion, and the thing to do was to try and get to California to work in Silicon Valley. And I then went and spent a year in San Francisco, which was also a very exciting part of the States to be. So in a sense, I've lived in the two most progressive parts of the United States, the wonderful city of Boston and Massachusetts, which usually returns Democrats, and then San Francisco and Northern California, which also normally returns Democrats.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, especially that point regarding like how Harvard was more international in a way than Oxbridge, which that sounds great. And of course, after you went to California, like, and living up the sun there, you went back to Britain, and then we went into law and became a barrister. I understand now, even in 2021, there's not a lot of Black people around in law, and especially Black men, which we will come to in a sec. But if that was the case now, I can't imagine what it was like back, before 20 years ago. What was it like, back then, being a young Black person within the legal system, being a barrister, and how did that teach you a lot into becoming an MP and Shadow Justice Secretary?
I really wanted to be a barrister. I was quite sure I wanted to be a barrister and not a solicitor. In a way, it was far easier to become a solicitor than a barrister. Being a barrister felt quite elitist and quite far, really, from where I was sitting to get there. And it wasn't easy. I mean, look, you do this pupillage thing, which is like a year-long interview. That's a tremendous amount of pressure for a young Black man, I'll be honest with you. And it certainly felt like that at the time. And the year that I had applied to the Inns of Court School of Law, which was the only place where you could do the bar qualification at that stage, it's changed now, but then you could only go to that one place. There were a group of Black kids taking the Inns of Court School of Law to court because they had failed them. They had introduced a kind of mock advocacy test, and they were sort of routinely failing these Black kids, because they had dreadlocks or whatever, didn't look like barristers, and they were challenging this. And I thought, Christ, if I've come this far and I'm going to fail. And that's in fact why I applied to Harvard law school. It was as a plan B. It was a pretty sort of extraordinary plan B, but it was my plan B. I thought I'd better have a plan B. Now I got through the Inns of Court School of Law. It wasn't an easy environment, I think, looking back on it. There weren't many black men there. I actually made friends with one of the only other ones that were there. We're still great friends to this day. He's a QC, and it wasn't, it wasn't the easiest of environments, I'll be honest with you. And the bar wasn't the easiest of environments. You were aware that you were pioneering, really. It was a very, very all white environment. Chambers was, most chambers were, unless you were lucky enough to get into a very left-wing chambers, like Tooks Court or Doughty Street. I'm actually an associate tenant at Doughty Street, where there was more diversity, but on the whole, it was a pretty white affair. And but the truth is, I had gone to a secondary school where that was the case. I was the only black kid there, so I wasn't as fazed by that as others were. But I think looking back on it, in terms of that ability to flourish and succeed, it was present in my mind. And I sometimes talk about imposter syndrome, which you can have, all sorts of people have it. You get somewhere and then you're just like, why am I here? Who am I? How do I fit in? And I think on reflection, in those early years at the bar, I did have imposter syndrome. I wasn't sure that I belonged here. And, you would walk into court and often be confused for the defendant, refused entry, told you were in the wrong entrance. Those sorts of things happen quite a lot as a young barrister going to court to represent people. But it was very empowering for me as a young lawyer, particularly if I was, going, in the youth court or representing a black defendant, usually a young black defendant. It was very, very empowering. And you knew that when you walked through the cell and they suddenly saw you, their shoulders lifted at that point, because it was unusual and unexpected. So that was quite rewarding, I remember, even if I lost the case.
I mean, this is really, really interesting, like hearing the legal career and like some of the things that's happened and like the challenges go through. But of course, one stressful occupation in law is not enough. You wanted to go into politics, so that's the big. So that was the big thing. You want to go into politics. You were elected to London. You were on the London Assembly, but then 2000 the seat in Tottenham became available. Now, I'll give a brief thing. I was born on the 10th of April 2000. Bernie Grant died a few days before I was born. And so to me, he is more of a mystical beast, like a mystical legend, rather than someone who is a real person. And because he is such an iconic figure, not only in Labour history, not only in black organizers within the Labour Party, but in black history as a whole, black British history as a whole. And so, for me to think about Bernie Grant as some sort of legend, what was it like to succeed him? And what was Bernie like as a person, first of all, and what was it like to fill his big boots, figuratively, but also literally?
Well, look, I've got to just, before I get to the wonderful, great Bernie Grant, I just need to say a little bit before that. It's important to understand that certainly being working class, growing up poor, black, from Tottenham, I begun to want to get into politics, but I did not easily see the possibility of becoming a member of parliament, certainly not at a young age. That had not really been cracked or done. And that is why I applied to be on the new London Assembly. Ken Livingstone was coming back. Labour had set a project of giving London regional government back. And I applied to be on the Assembly. And the process of applying to be on the Assembly meant that you had to go round London CLPs in order to get nominations. So I became known in a year, 18 months, as I sort of toured these constituencies asking if they would support me to be on the GLA. And eventually ended up on the new GLA, which was incredibly exciting at a young age. Of course, I knew Bernie Grant, and he was a great man. We were related, both of our parents from Guyana. He was very kind and generous to me, coming up as a young lawyer and then wanting to get into politics. One of the last things he did before he died was he wrote to Tony Blair, raising hell about the lack of selection of Black candidates, and he name checked a few of us, and I was one of the people that he named. He was a giant. He had been ill for a while, but he died sort of slightly suddenly, and far too young. I mean, Bernie was in his early 50s when he died. And I put my hat into the ring because I had all this confidence. I'd just come back from Harvard in the States. I had a lot of confidence. I mean, I look back and I can't quite believe that I threw my hat into the ring to become the MP for Tottenham at the age of 26, but I did. And it was a tough contest. His wife also tried to get the seat, but I think in the end, the local Labour Party selected me in part because I was genuinely the local candidate. I was from born and raised Tottenham. And they went with it. And yes, of course, following on from Bernie was daunting and huge, massive. And people would often say these are big shoes to fill. And they were huge shoes to fill. I think 21 years later, I've probably filled them, but there was no replacing Bernie because Bernie was unique and irreplaceable. But what I think has happened is that I've grown into being me. I would say, certainly in the last 10 years or so, it's about finding your own voice and being you. And that's a certain authentic voice. And that's, I think, what people respond to in a constituency like mine. They want to hear and see you, and that voice has got to be authentic to the nature of the constituencies. Bernie, like my parents, was not born in the UK. He was born in the Caribbean, in Guyana, from the Caribbean, had come to the UK in that sense as a first-generation immigrant. I think I bring something else, and that is that I was born here. I ain't going anywhere else. And a certain kind of confidence that comes from that determination. I don't actually like the phrase second generation immigrant because I'm not. I was born here. And educated here, and educated quite well here, and of course in the United States. And that's what I bring to bear on behalf of my constituents, my voice to bear on, to do the best I can.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting, of course, and yeah, like you said, you're very right about how you're David Lammy, and how Bernie Grant is irreplaceable and still very much a person that should be remembered as someone who's been so iconic, and some great voices. I'm going to jump forward quite a bit because from Labour and government. But when I first recognized you when I was like 13, 14, 15, when you're on the backbenches. Now,
there's one other point that's just occurred to me that people should remember about Bernie Grant. It's not just Bernie Grant, it's Bernie Grant, it's Margaret Hodge, it's Jeremy Corbyn to some extent, So what there was also in the 1980s was a hell of a lot of vilification of Labour and the loony left. And actually at that time, there were these great council leaders, and Bernie was the leader of Haringey Council. I mentioned Margaret Hobb because she was the leader of Islington Council. I mentioned Jeremy because he was a Haringey councillor. But there was this group of councillors across London, and they ended up becoming MPs. And they were very much at the forefront of fighting Margaret Thatcher alongside Ken Livingstone and things, in terms of being in office, running stuff and fighting her. And that people forget that Bernie had been leader of the council, which is one of the reasons why he was so beloved, because he had stood up for his community as leader of the council, of course, famously, during some very tough times, particularly with the police, and during the riots, which was prior to him becoming an MP in 1987. Sorry to cut you, but it's an important point.
No, that's fine. It's like, I was always, I'm sorry to really make you feel old, but it's always interesting to hear like stuff that before I was born, like how these now MPs used to act, you know, when I were in the council, fighting against Margaret Thatcher and the various Tory governments before then.
Tessa Jowell, there's another one in Camden Council.
Yeah, also like
Frank Dobson, there's another one.
Yeah.
Sorry, the names are coming back to me, all these people that were actually council leaders and councillors.
Yeah, not only fighting against Thatcher government, but also, you know, 70s and 80s, we're talking about also the far right and the National Front. So, you know, it's really, really interesting to see what they've done before, working with anti-racist groups and the Labour movement beforehand. And so I'm dropping forward to my question now. One of the things that the first time I really recognized you and the work you've been doing was when you were asked by David Cameron to lead the Lammy review, which of course was a huge review in, you know, political bias within the justice system. Now I don't really know government policy when it comes to the reviews, but it's very rare that that the government would ask a sitting member of the opposition to lead a review. First of all, what was it like? What was it like to actually do that review and to look at all the evidence and to find this bias and injustice? And then, of course, secondly, the government hasn't implemented yet, and we've always been asking to implement it. How frustrating was it to see all of that and then have the successive prime ministers in Theresa May and Boris Johnson just not implement it and completely ignore it?
Well, look, I was very surprised when I got the call from David Cameron to lead the review. And I was slightly, you know, I remember inquiring whether they were expecting me to become a Tory, checking that this was going to be an independent review, that I would be given the appropriate resources to do it. And all those guarantees were given, and I decided that this would be the opportunity of a lifetime to lead the review into this subject that I had spent a lot of time in politics talking about, caring about considerably. So I spent 2 years touring the country, all over the country, spending time in prisons and courts, probation settings with young people, adults, women, getting into the issues. I also was able to go to other common law jurisdictions, obviously the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, because the truth is every country has an overrepresentation of minorities in its jails. And the big question is why and how you fix it. And, you know, this is not actually just the Black community. We've got an increasing Muslim population in our prisons. I think the most overrepresented group in our prisons proportionately are people from Gypsy Roma traveller backgrounds. And I was also insistent that the issue is not just about stop and search. that tends to be focused on. But the truth is, there are issues before stop and search, the care system, who gets excluded from schools and the education system, of course, poverty. And there are issues after stop and search, how you treated by young legal aid lawyers, how you're treated by the Crown Prosecution Service in terms of how you're charged, what's your experience when you go to court, how do you plead, do you go to a magistrate's court where you can get a lesser sentence, or do you go to a Crown court? What's your experience if you do go to prison? Does it help you? Does it reduce your chances of committing a second crime, or does it increase your chances of of committing a crime? So those were all the issues that I looked at, and I had an advisory board. It wasn't just me. On my advisory board were people like Trevor Phillips, Sean Bailey, the Conservative candidate against Sadiq Khan, most recently in London, but also Keir Starmer, who was not at that point leader of the Labour Party or even an MP, I don't think. He had just stopped being DPP. It was a balanced advisory panel in order for me to get the recommendations, the 35 recommendations that I made. And it was really well received when I reported, right across the political divide. And it goes to this point when you're asked to do a review or an inquiry, it's really important it's done in good faith and it's received in good faith, because you want your inquiry implemented. And I've got to pay credit to David Cameron and Theresa May, both of whom received the report very, very well indeed. There has been a change of tone since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. You will know that he has advisors in Number 10 who don't recognise issues of systemic racism, have views that are sort of, you can see in that Saw report. And Boris has gone down that direction, even though when he was Mayor of London, he didn't push that agenda at all. And so we're now in this place where, yeah, I mean, they aren't getting on with my review. And by the way, I would say that when I did my review, 41% of those in our youth justice system came from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. Today, that number is 51%. So it's got much, much worse. That is a staggeringly depressing figure. And it's actually worse than even the United States of America per capita. And not very much is being done to address it. And my review's now, 5 years old. So this is, it's a big subject, one I care a lot about. It's why I want to become Secretary of State for Justice, so I can fix this and a few other things in our justice system.
Yeah, you're absolutely damn right about that. And I presume on day one, like when Labour win, on day one, you'll be knocking down the street with Keir Starmer, basically saying, yeah, well, first things first, let's implement the review. But also, like when you're Justice Secretary and you're in that building, you're in the office, and one of the things you have to look at is a lot of things. What do you think justice reform would mean to the Labour government and to you as Justice Secretary?
Oh, I think that the justice agenda is going to be very important. We've got a justice system now on its knees. We've got a backlog that's starting to rise above 60,000 cases. Victims of crime are suffering because they're not going to see justice. We've got rape prosecutions down to their lowest ever on record. We've got an increasing prison population and a probation system because of the reforms that Chris Grayling brought in that's on its knees. We've got a legal aid system that's battered and bruised, and we've got massive advice deserts across the country, whole tracts of the north of England where you can't get access to a legal aid lawyer, you can't get access to advice. And we've got a government not getting on with fixing those issues, but intent on doing away with our human rights, restricting our ability to challenge the government through judicial review, tearing up international treaties that they've signed up to in relation to Northern Ireland. So we're in a very, 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 very sorry place. It's going to be a hell of a lot for Labour to fix when it comes to office. I don't believe we should be increasing the prison population for women. I think we should be setting ourselves an ambition for reducing the amount of women in prison, partly because if you put a woman in prison, you're usually condemning her children to the criminal justice system or the care system. Our youth justice system has not been reformed since Tony Blair came to power. There's a lot to do there with the problems we've got with youth violence and having a youth justice system that's fit for purpose. And then the agenda I set out in the Lammy review is not just an agenda for Black, Asian and minority ethnic people in the justice system. All of my recommendations apply to the system per se and go right across the system. Things like deferred prosecutions, which is a way of dealing with first and second time offenders that doesn't criminalize them, sorts out their problem, anger management, drug addiction, violence, problem solving approach, if you like. Recommendations I made on a diverse judiciary. We do need more women judges. We do need ethnic minorities. We do need targets, and we need a judicial appointments commission that's fit for purpose. Recommendations on recruiting better prison officers and prison governors. All of those recommendations are recommendations that the Labour government can get on and fix. I'm very pleased that I've been on this journey now. Actually, I've been Shadow Justice Secretary, obviously, since Keir Starmer became leader. But actually, the agenda, the justice agenda, is one that Keir and I have been working on for 5 years because of my review. So it's well needed and well overdue that we get a Labour Secretary of State for Justice, and that we restore our justice system, and we restore a sense of law and order in our country, because it's now, particularly in relation to violence against women and girls, we're seeing the huge problems that are opening up across the country.
Yeah, I think on that quick point of violence against women and girls, before I move on, there was I was really the stories of spiking really recently in the past few weeks or so has been extremely concerning for me and concerning so many other people. And I was just wondering, what was your take on those stories, and just what should be done to
Oh, well, there's a whole raft of things you've got to do. You've got to stop the passing the buck back and forth between the Crown Prosecution Service and the police on rape convictions. You've got to support women right from the get-go and right through the process and at the end of the process. We've got to fix this terrible problem of asking women for their smartphones and them feeling as if they're suddenly no longer the victim, but they're the perpetrator in our justice system. It does need resource. And you've got to get serious about minimum sentences for rape. You should not do 4 years for rape, in my view. And we've been really clear about that. We need to be dealing with street harassment, and we need to be dealing with misogyny as a hate crime. All of those things are things that Labour proposed in its Green Paper. I was very proud to publish that Green Paper with Nick Thomas-Symonds. And we can be getting on with this. And it's staggering that the Conservative government isn't getting on with it. It's just sort of leaving all of these proposals to go to sit on the shelf.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's really, really good and really, really interesting to hear. I want to refer you to an answer you had previously when you're talking about Bernie Grant, and you said one of the last things he did before he sadly passed away was write to Tony Blair about the amount of Black people being selected among the Labour Party. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to write a letter to Keir Starmer to this, but I think there is still a feeling about that frustrating with the barriers in there. And I'm very proud to host events with 2/3 of the black male MPs within the Parliamentary Labour Party, until you recognise there's only 3 MPs, and I've had conversations with 2, which is Clive Lewis and you, David Lammy. I think do you share the frustrating that for a lot of black men within the Labour Party, even when they want to get involved, there is just so many things against them, black people generally, but especially black men. In 2018, only 87 black male councillors was elected as a whole within the country. And, what do you think should change, and what do you think should be? Because that kind of representation within politics is very, very important.
Look, I think that we've got some way to go here. I think that all women shortlists have delivered more women to Parliament, and have delivered more black women to Parliament. But I think it is important to recognise that black men sit really, in a very difficult socioeconomic and system, and they really are bear the brunt in so many ways of systemic racism, and that's brutally captured by the footage that saw the end of the life of George Floyd. And we have got to do better in the Labour Party, much, much better than we have been doing. We need black men that cover the breadth of the black male experience in this country. I'm very privileged, yes, to have grown up poor and working class, but in the end to have gone to an elite university to be a barrister, and here I sit. I'm at Paul Boateng. Was certainly from a particular background, Ghanaian experience, family that were politicians, Chuka Amuna, similarly, well, I think went to a private school. I think he had a grandfather that was a judge. I'm not knocking the experience. The experience is valid and important, but it doesn't cover the breadth, does it? If you then look at our white colleagues, there's a bit more breadth from manual workers, firemen, teachers, business leader, breadth of experience, and similarly you do need that across minority groups. And so the representation isn't there in numbers, but it's not there in terms of background. And I do think the black male experience is, you can't genuinely say Black Lives Matter, and then when it comes down to it, fail to select black men. And so it would be wrong if I wasn't critical of my own party for not doing more to make this happen.
Yeah, and yeah, that speaks a lot to me. And so yeah, thank you for that, David. And there is good. I have to say there are good steps. I think the new parliamentary candidates program, which looks really, really good. And I know a lot of friends who were successful, a lot of friends who were unsuccessful, but I hope they stay involved. And of course, fingers crossed, whenever it comes about the Bernie Grant leadership program, will come back soon. I just wanted to say, because I keep forgetting myself to say this, but if you are here, if you're on the Zoom, please ask a question if you want to. We will have time to. In fact, I have one written down question before this, so if you want to ask a question to David Lammy, it could be on anything. Well, not anything, but do down, and I'll try my best to make sure we give those to David. But one more thing I have to raise is another recent story. Of course, tragically, last Friday we saw the death of Sir David Amess. Happened in us, and of course, this is the second time in the second time in the past 5 years that a member of Parliament was killed. and and of course this harks back to the focus on safety of not only MPs but MP staffs and public figures on a whole. Statistically, we all know that a lot of these public figures receive abuse, be it social media or on the streets actually. But we do know that significantly more so that this hits minorities. So of course, that shocking statistic that Diane Abbott received, all of the hate that women MPs received by Amnesty International, all the hate that MPs received, Diane Abbott received half of those during the 2017 general election. And so many other people, including you, were abused. And I have to raise that. So how do you feel with this death and that connection between abuse, but also what really should be done to tackle abuse within our society and racism within our society like this?
Well, look, I want to put on record that David Amess was a friend of mine. We got on incredibly well. He was a well-liked, well-loved politician. There can be friendships across the House. We had fundamentally different political views. But like a lot of friendships, we didn't talk very much about politics. He wanted to understand aspects of life in the Labour Party, and I often wanted to understand aspects of life in the Conservative Party. So that's when we talked about politics. But he had a tremendous sense of humour, and it was an Eastender really, and I'm a sort of North London boy, so we had a lot in common in so many ways. And I was devastated first when I saw the news that he'd been stabbed, and then a few hours later when we found out that he'd passed away. It's a matter of record. I mean, you can Google the abuse that I've received, the threats that I've received myself. I did check with the police, and I've received 13 there are 13 cases since the beginning of last year that the police have been investigating that have led to criminal opening criminal files, and there have been 4 that have led to intelligence requests. That is the nature of being an MP, and you just have to look at my Twitter feed to see the abuse on a daily basis that I receive by virtue of the colour of my skin and saying the things that I say in our public life. I've got used to it, to be honest. It's my family and friends that will never really get used to it and that worry when wonderful people like David Amess and Joe Cox are struck down in this way. Some of it has to be dealt with by getting serious about online harm. The government have been talking about a bill for a very long time. It has not come forward, and frankly this is an area of public policy where you would sort of expect a bill every couple of years, a bit like an education bill, because the technology moves and you have to move with the times, and yet we still haven't had one online harms bill. But never mind, we should have had 2 or 3, I think, by now. It looks like Boris Johnson has agreed that we've got to have something before Christmas. Well, that was what Keir Starmer was able to get out of him at Prime Minister's Questions this week, and that is a good thing, and we need to work cross-party on this. And perhaps David's death reminds us that we need to work cross-party on it, and Keir has said that, look, we'll vote for the online harms bill because we need it. That's a way of addressing it, but we've got to do a lot about our culture in society. I think it's a culture that's grown more toxic since the referendum decision, the decision to leave the European Union, for sure. I think it's being driven by culture wars and a sort of renewed ethnic nationalism on the right. I think on the left, sometimes cancel culture and a sort of shrillness for differences of opinion don't help. But I do think social media is driving particularly young people into silos and to extremism. whether it's far-right extremism or Islamicist extremism. It's the same phenomenon, I think, that we're all experiencing.
Yeah, and that I've been saying this all night, but that is really like that is fascinating. It's interesting to see, and yeah, of course, Boris Johnson. Let's hope he sticks to this promise and not make another lie in Parliament like he does. And that online harms bill is published and is what comes back in and gets passed in Parliament. I have one question from the Q&A, and that is from Laura Davidson, who is the chair of the Young Fabians Criminal Justice Working Group. I hope I got that right, but shout out to her. And she said, how can Labour better integrate the public health approach into our justice policy?
It's a very good question. Before defund the police grew as a phenomenon out of the United States, we were talking in this country about a public health approach, which I personally thought was a better way of describing some of the challenges that exist in our criminal justice system. That is that, can we please focus on the epidemic of knife crime and gang culture and the issues that are stoking that, the issues around our education system, our care system, trauma and how we support young people in trauma, and there are all sorts of issues. Try and get an appointment as a parent with child adolescent mental health, and the wait now is about 2 years for therapy. And you imagine if you're a young man who's seen a stabbing and you have to wait 2 years for therapy. Where do you take that trauma? How does that trauma manifest in you? Does it lead to you picking up a knife? So that's what a public health approach is about. And it's hugely important. Sadiq Khan has tried a lot here in the City of London. We're very fortunate to have him, but he can't do this on his own. He needs a Home Secretary that's going to put well into it. And I'm not sure we're hearing this at all from Priti Patel. And there are issues right across the country. So I think that we need to get back to a public health approach. And we would see that if we had a Labour government, for sure.
So yeah, that's a really interesting one, and that it seems just fascinating me, the public health. So shout out to Lauren, and if you are involved in Young Fabians, first of all, join the Fabian Society. That's a must, but also get involved with the working groups like the justice policy folk.
There's a question I can see from Henry Mendoza about anonymity. I personally am really clear that I don't believe that the case for anonymity in social media is made out. I don't like it. I don't like fake profiles. Now, how you do that, I think, is a bit more complicated. So, for example, it may be that the way you sign up to an account, your address, your details, your bank account details, your passport number, so that you can be identified, is the key, so that law enforcement and others, if they need it, can see exactly who you are. That is slightly different, isn't it, from the ability, for example, as you put in your question, to be gay and to want a fake profile because you're not out at that point in your life, to family or friends in a particular way. So I do understand that concern, but the bottom line is, at the moment, you can open a social media account with only an email address, effectively, and then you can say what the hell you want. And I just don't think that Wild West situation can continue. You can also, it means you can also groom, fish, do all sorts of things on the internet that are just unacceptable. So for all of those reasons, I'm very suspicious of the need to maintain anonymity to the extent and I probably should put stress to the extent that we're seeing currently across social media.
I feel because we are running a bit of time, I'm gonna join the next two questions because I do want to ask just one more quick question, but I'm gonna join sort of Matthew Marshall's and Dylan's questions together. So Matthew was, of course, how do we eradicate racist attitudes within society and emphasize the importance of tolerance and mutual respect? And Dylan was, as a law student, I'm aware that I have a responsibility to fight systemic racism in our justice system. What advice would you give to the next generation of lawyers who are determined to take down those barriers?
Look, it took several hundred years to create this system of scientific racism that allowed white European middle-class men to colonize much of the world, to put people like me at the bottom of the pecking order and to put themselves at the top. They weren't great, by the way, to white working class men at the time, or certainly to women, but nevertheless, they created the scientific racism that has led us to this point, and it's going to take quite a long time to get rid of it. I'm encouraged by the millennials and younger. I'm encouraged by the Black Lives Matter marches. I'm encouraged by white allies speaking out and saying enough is enough, we've got to do more. And also saying we want to understand this colonial history. Why are you writing Black people and their stories out of our history? So I'm optimistic about your generation and what it can do, but realistic that it's going to, I'm afraid the business about being systemic means that we have a lot to do. Keep reading. There's lots of books out there, but the other thing I would say is, look, we tend to focus a lot on Blackness. And in a way, there isn't much more for me to say, or Black people to say about the fact of racism. All the books have been written, all the poetry has been made, all the songs have been written. This subject is as much about whiteness. And so it's a sort of challenge to you that are, to go out there and to sometimes be in uncomfortable places, but to challenge the racism that you see. And important to bear in mind that the Black community in this country is 4% of the population, and ethnic minorities make up 14% of the population. So we will always need, here in Europe, this is not the United States, serious allies who are prepared to, put their shoulder to the wheel and get their hands dirty in relation to this subject, or we won't make any progress. So yes, of course you have a responsibility if you're going to become a lawyer, massive responsibility to make a difference, with who you recruit, who you represent, how you challenge within the spaces that you find in your career. It sometimes worries me that racism isn't just for me to speak out on. It's got to be something that my white colleagues feel is comfortable speaking out on as well, or we're not going to make the progress that we need to make.
Yeah, that's amazing, and that's great, and that is really, yeah. So balls on your court, white people, if you're listening, sort of thing. But yeah, the need of allies. I'm going to ask, I know I'm mindful of time, so this is my last question, and it is a joint question with our anonymous attendee. It is like a bit of a joint question. So the Q&A said, Stephen Bush has said that the first British Black Prime Minister will likely be a Conservative. Do you agree? Why and why not? And this kind of relates to my question is, I'm not asking you to do anything, but also, do you think in our lifetime or in the near future, will the Labour Party have a Black leader, or will we see the first?
I have no idea. I haven't got a crystal ball. I mean, all sorts of things have happened in politics just in the last 10 years, the last 5 years, the last 5 months. I mean, I just cannot answer that question. Look, I wouldn't be a member of Parliament if I, here in this country, and it's a huge privilege to be a member of Parliament, as much as it's my job and our job to critique the country, I've got to say squarely, I love this country. I love the fact that I was born in this country. I love being English. I love the fact that my parents made a home here. I love British sense of humor. I love the countryside. You know, I love my football team, Spurs. And there are amazing, amazing things that emanate from Britain. Things that people thought were never possible then become possible. And so to answer your question, could there be an ethnic minority prime minister? Of course there could. In our lifetimes, soon, of course it's possible. And could they come from any political party? Absolutely. You know, I've been watching the Blair Brown years, and one of the things that I was reminded of, was of course the sudden death of John Smith, and that elevated, if you like, Tony and Gordon into a position they didn't want to be in, but they were far sooner than they thought they would be. Look, anything can happen in politics. No one saw Margaret Thatcher coming, and then she arrived. No one saw Jeremy Corbyn coming, and then he arrived. So the one thing I've learned is the crystal ball does not work in the business of politics, that countries can swing violently in a different direction. So we will at some point be having a very different conversation to the one we're having about Boris Johnson running our country. And I am not going to guess or anticipate where we will get to in terms of ethnic minority representation. I never believed, I have to say, that we would have the numbers of minority colleagues we have in Parliament now, even though there are still problems with Black men. Actually, in terms of the ethnic minority representation, it's considerably better than it was when I arrived in 2000. So let's see where we get to. But my God, I've been in Parliament 21 years. Much has changed just in 5. So I suspect 5 years from now, a hell of a lot could have happened.
Well, yeah, that's definitely interesting. And yeah, unfortunately, very, very sad, I have to end it here because I know you have a hard stop at 9:30. But I just want to thank you, David Lammy, for coming along and having a chance and to speak with the young Fabians. Yeah, so thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Good to see you. Keep going.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Take care. And as David Lammy leads, I'll shout out the young Fabians. I'm sure Mark might want to say a few words, but I'm not so sure. Shout out to young Fabians. Please join them if you had to. But not only shout out to the young Fabians, but also shout out to the BAME advocacy group. So Henry and Leon, especially. You guys are amazing. And like everyone who asked questions, thank you so much. I hope there is. I hope that gives a chance to speak, but also, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will leave you, and I hope you enjoy your Thursday evening, and I hope you learn a bit. But, like as David said, we've written enough, we've wrote poems enough, and we've written enough songs. It's now time for us to act. So long live the Labour movement. I'll hand it over to Mark now.
Eamon, that was brilliant. You were fantastic, and you really covered everything at the end. So the only thing I wanted to say is a huge thank you and well done to you, and thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight. I hope you do join the Young Fabians if you haven't already, and check out all the great work Eamon's doing with the 1987 caucus as well. Thanks so much, everyone.
See you guys.
Have a good night.